Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the Zoom dorm or African world or an African world. Welcome to another edition of the African Literature Association lecture series. The first in 2000, the second one actually in 2021. My name is Akin Adeshokon. I teach comparative literature and cinema and media studies at Indiana University, Bloomington, Indiana, and I coordinate this series with my colleagues, Grima Negash, president of the Association of African Literature, and with Matt Brown of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and James McCockle of William and Hobart College in Geneva, New York. Excuse me. Our speaker today is Cara Moyer-Duncan, a scholar and associate professor of Africana Studies at Emerson College in Boston, Massachusetts. As always, it's our pleasure to welcome our speakers and audiences to this event. I wish to underscore the point that this is one of the initiatives by the current Executive Council of the Association to engage our members' interest and generate even more interest among literary communities across the world, particularly those in the field of African and post-colonial literary and cultural studies. This has become even more pertinent than before. That is at the time when we didn't have to confront the reality of life in discrete and mediated bubbles, like doing things via Zoom, which are imposed by COVID-19 restrictions. So even as you enjoy these lectures, which are free and open to the public, we hope that you will take the time, the attention further by opting to join the association. I would like to introduce the speaker more formally to those who may not be familiar with her. In a series that has featured a number of collaborative speakers, all formal lectures, Cara Moyer-Duncan appears as one of the 3 single author speakers that will feature in the remainder of this academic year. These are members of the association who have recently published monographs and who pursue research that seek to expand the scope of African literary and cultural studies in new and exciting ways. Cara is Associate Professor of Africana Studies at Emerson College, where she also serves as Program Coordinator for the school's Prison Initiative at Emerson. Her book, Projecting Nation, South African Cinemas After 1994, from which today's lecture takes off, investigates the national and transnational forces that have shaped the representation of race and nation in feature-length narrative fiction films produced in the country. The monograph is new, it's hard, and it's very much awaited. It came out last year out of Michigan State University Press. The questions at the heart of the book are quite subtle and I must say very enticing. For example, one question, how does a historically marginalizing, if old, cinematic culture such as South Africa's negotiate new terrains of representation which require but are not reducible to fostering socioeconomic needs such as job creation? How well can South African producers, investors, and marketers make films that a Black spectatorship could be proud of while caring about what South African audiences need? Cara has also authored several articles on South African cinema, including resistance documentaries in post-apartheid South Africa, Dear Mandela and Minor Shutdown, which was published in the Journal of African Cinemas. So these questions have been with her for some time. Her lecture today is titled South African Cinema After 1994. As usual, our lecturer will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes and will devote the remainder of the time to questions and answers. So please feel free to write your questions and comments in the discussion box on the channel, and we'll do our best to respond to them. Thank you, and over to you, Cara.
Thank you, Akin, for that wonderful introduction. And hello to everyone, and thank you for coming to this lecture. It's an honor to be invited to contribute to the African Literature Association's lecture series. I attended my first ALA meeting in 2008 when I was a PhD student. And since that time, ALA has been a home to me as I developed as a scholar and as a teacher. Thanks to Akin and Gurmai and Matt and James for all the work that they have done to organize this event today. South African cinema has been the subject of my research for about 20 years, and that has largely coincided with the development of the post-1994 film industry. Of course, 1994 is a monumental year in South Africa's history. It's the year that South Africa had its first multiracial election, which brought to power the first Black majority government with the African National Congress at the helm. That government determined that film has the potential to fortify the new democracy by promoting social cohesion, stimulating economic development, and creating jobs. In 1999, it created the National Film and Video Foundation, which I'll refer to as the NFVF for the remainder of my talk. And it charged that agency with fostering a national cinema, raising hope for the emergence of a vibrant, socially engaged, and self-sufficient film industry with the potential to invigorate filmmaking, not just in South Africa, but in other parts of the African continent. I'm going to share my screen. My book begins by reflecting on a panel discussion on the distribution of South African films at the Durban International Film Festival in 2017. A Black scriptwriting student asked a panel of film industry notables whether they cared about showing films that a Black kid could be proud of. Matteo Matsau, chief of sales and marketing for Ster-Kinekor, replied by saying, "I only care about South African audiences." As the nation's largest distributor and exhibitor of films, Ster-Kinekor considers South African audiences essential to its bottom line, and growing local audiences by offering engaging content is understandably important to them. Caring about paying audiences, however, is not the same as caring about race and representation. Ster-Kinekor and its competitor, New Metro, are the two dominant players in distribution and exhibition. They have a monopolistic hold on these aspects of the film industry that they've carried over from the colonial and apartheid eras, respectively. South African cinema has so far failed to fulfill the role envisioned for it in 1994. South African films do not yet accurately reflect the nation's multiplicity of racial identities, tell stories that are rich in local nuance, or contribute to social cohesion. They seldom succeed financially, and the racial makeup of the film industry does not reflect that of the nation. My book identifies the internal and transnational forces that have affected South African cinema since 1994. It considers how the legacies of colonialism and apartheid, the cultural and economic effects of globalization and neoliberal policies, specific practices related to production, distribution, and exhibition, as well as audience and critical reception, have affected how South African feature-length narrative fiction films imagine race and nation. It also considers how a focus on job creation and economic growth has affected the social and artistic potential of cinema as the government has endeavored to create a national cinema. And it examines how continued poverty and inequality determine who has access to the nation's films and the way that those films are accessed. The exchange between the student and Matsau captures some of the tensions in the post-1994 film industry and the issues that my book grapples with. The representation of race has social and political implications for a fledgling nation like South Africa as it seeks to reimagine itself and transcend both a past and a present marked by racial and economic inequality. These issues are compounded by the nation's small cinema-going audience, as movie theaters are economically and geographically out of reach for most Black South Africans. More than half of South Africans live in poverty, and the cheapest movie tickets cost about 5% of monthly income at the poverty line. That most theaters are megaplexes located at shopping malls in what were formerly white suburbs makes going to the cinema even further out of reach. This is a legacy of the spatial policies of colonialism and apartheid. As the map you see shows, approximately 84% of movie theaters are concentrated in 3 provinces: Gauteng, the Western Cape, and KwaZulu-Natal. These theaters are overwhelmingly large cineplexes that are owned by either Ster-Kinekor or New Metro. In fact, they own 85% of theaters and are housed in shopping malls or city centers, shopping malls and city centers or suburbs that cater to a middle class or upper class clientele. There are only a few movie theaters in townships. South Africa has a population of 55 million people, but as of 2017, it only has 93 movie theaters. South African screens, like screens in other nations, are inundated with Hollywood films, which have their own issues with race and representation. And when local films have made it into local theaters, Black characters have largely featured as violent gangsters, victims of the AIDS pandemic, secondary to more complex white characters, or in the case of South Africa's most popular local filmmaker, at least as defined by box office performance, Leon Schuster, comedic fodder for a white actor in blackface. In a society fractured along the lines of race, ethnicity, language, class, and gender, questions around how cinema figures into the nation-building project are complex. Should cinema be using its artistic potential to help audiences contend with their past and imagine their future? Or given the high levels of inequality and unemployment, should the film industry develop its economic potential and contribute to job creation? Though they sometimes converge, these objectives are in many ways competing. By examining recent feature-length fiction films, I trace how the tension between these goals has resulted in the multiple forms of South African cinema that have emerged since 1994. A national cinema has not emerged in South Africa, even though the film industry there is amongst the world's oldest. South Africa's history of colonialism and apartheid and the racial exclusion that persists 2 decades into the new democracy is part of the reason. Of course, the South African film industry has been transnational since its establishment. That it has always been fueled by and intertwined with global forces has made establishing a clear and stable national identity in the realm of cinema even more elusive. To give some context, this question of a national cinema in South Africa has been debated since the mid-1990s. Jacqueline Maingard was perhaps the first scholar to consider South African cinema as national, with the publication of her book, South African National Cinema, in 2007. Maingard had previously argued in an earlier publication, there is no national cinema in South Africa, even though some cinema might seem or seek to represent or evoke a sense of the national. Though Maingard does not explain why she comes to this conclusion, one can assume it was because during the colonial and apartheid eras, and in the decade or so after, South African cinema failed to engage and reflect what she describes as the multiplicities of subjectivities or identities in South Africa. Maingard argues that her shift in understanding was made possible by rapid transformations of the industry beginning in the late 1990s. Other scholars are more skeptical about the existence of a national cinema. Nyasha Mboti and Kian Tomaselli argue the continued exclusion of the economically disenfranchised Black majority from the state's funding agencies prohibits the possibility of a national cinema. Lucia Sachs raises questions about the existence of a national cinema because the new democracy emerged at a time that she says has been described as post-national, global, transnational, hybrid, fluid, porous, multicultural, diverse, and decentered. Hasina Ibrahim calls for a polycentric approach rather than a nation-centric approach in mapping South Africa's contemporary cinemascape, given the diversity of cinematic practices that now abound in South Africa, many of which are outside of the mainstream. So with that debate in mind, I argue that South Africa has a national film industry, but it doesn't yet have a national cinema. If national cinemas are dispersed rather than coherent, as O'Regan argues, then the range of production practices and screen identities that exist in South Africa could be considered national. However, given the extent to which Black South Africans remain excluded from creating and accessing their own nation's cinema, it's difficult to conceive of it as national. Since the onset of democracy, the film industry has been transformed in some remarkable ways. From 2010 to 2016, a total of 163 films, local films, were released in theaters. Diversity increased somewhat amongst the ranks of filmmakers, with 22 Black South African men, 2 Black South African women, and 13 white South African women directing films. South African films are regularly featured at international festivals, and several films have been distributed internationally and won prestigious awards. The nation has become a prime shooting location for foreign productions, and the number of international co-productions has increased. This activity has contributed to the growth of the film industry, which in 2017 had a total economic impact of 12.2 billion rand, or about $916 million. And it created about 21,000 jobs. The number of institutions offering training in film has also increased. Government intervention has facilitated these changes through tax incentives, production rebates, development and production grants, training bursaries, co-production treaties, support for attending local and international film festival, and developing local audiences. Despite these accomplishments, in many ways, South African cinema remains remarkably untransformed. South Africa is the most unequal country in the world, and though the ranks of middle and upper classes have become more diverse, over half of all South Africans live in poverty, with children, Black Africans, women, and people who live in rural areas most affected. Economic inequality and its connection to race and gender remain profoundly apparent in cinema. The film industry continues to be disproportionately white and male. For example, white men account for about 4% of the population, but about 70% of directors. Most skilled workers with full-time film industry jobs are white. Distribution and exhibition continues to be monopolized by Ster-Kinekor and New Metro, to the exclusion of Black and poor people and to the detriment of local films. And given the need for job creation, policies privilege film's economic potential over its social potential, which influences the way the nation is imagined in cinema, and thus impacts cinema's potential to contribute to social cohesion. And we can see these disparities if we look at a few charts. The first shows the race and nationality of directors for top 10 films in 2016 and 2017. 70% of top 10 films were directed by white South Africans. The second chart shows top 10 films from 2016 and 2017 by language. And films are overwhelmingly in Afrikaans and or English. My book seeks to understand the various ways film has represented race and nation, especially in light of what Mbai Chom describes as African experiences of cinema. That is to say, it's a study of South African cinemas after 1994. It acknowledges the multiplicity of practices in the spheres of production, distribution, and exhibition that emerged as the government attempted to cultivate a national cinema. Rather, it creates space for different experiences of cinema that are inevitably informed by different subjectivities. Projecting Nation offers analysis of cinematic texts informed by the political economic structure of the industry and film culture. The book is organized around 4 trends that aren't fixed or static, but offer insight into the state of the industry and the way its films imagine nation. The trends are: 1, films that target global audiences with local stories; 2, new aesthetic and thematic directions in independent cinema; 3, popular films geared towards local audiences; and 4, the refragmentation of local cinema with the rise of Afrikaans language films and the popularity of Nollywood-style local movies. So I'll start by discussing the first trend. A number of films feature local stories, but target global audiences and embrace the values and aesthetics associated with Hollywood. The NFVF has reinforced this practice with co-production agreements and by maintaining a presence at prestigious film festivals in order to be, quote, world-class. This approach privileges the economic potential of film and shapes the representation of race and nation in ways that limit their resonance with local audiences. It also reinforces the post-1994 South African brand of rainbowism, which is more myth than reality. And these films often feature Hollywood stars. Some of these films are available on Netflix. This trend includes films that redeem the global image of South Africa as part of the nation building project, including truth and reconciliation films like In My Country, released in 2004, a film based on Krog's memoir, Country of My Skull, and Mandela-centric films like the 2013 film Mandela, Long Walk to Freedom, based on his autobiography. It includes New Africa films that reinforce stereotypes about the continent and its people, like the AIDS drama Yesterday from 2004, the gangster film SCHUKSI from 2005, which won an Oscar, and the sci-fi flick District 9 from 2008. And it includes films that complicate the dominant narrative about Africa, but in ways that are familiar to Western audiences, like the animated film Kumba from 2013 and the queer love story The Wound from 2017. The second trend is focused on independent films. The onset of democracy saw the emergence of independent filmmakers seeking to understand the legacy of the past and what it means to be South African in the new South Africa. Their films fuse local stories with innovative aesthetics and reflect a multitude of identities and experiences. They often rely on funding from the NFVF for producing the film, and they also rely on festivals for distribution. These films take on controversial issues with national reverberations. However, limitations in the existing distribution and exhibition structure, the need for audience development, and the adoption of neoliberal practices within the film sector have hindered audience access to these films. Amongst these films are Ramadan Suleiman's Zulu Love Letter from 2004, Suleiman, the first Black director after 1994, sees cinema as a national therapy and offers a very different version of a truth and reconciliation film, one that's focused on healing within the Black community. There are a number of films that focus on identity and belonging. In terms of race, gender, class, and generation, films by Maganthri Pillay and Sib Shangwe Lemur reflect different positionalities, but both speak to a profound sense of confusion and a search for belonging, couched against the dominant myth of the Rainbow Nation, with their respective films 34 South from 2005 and Necktie Youth from 2015. There are films that are focused on non-belonging and xenophobia, like Akino Matosho's Man on Ground from 2011. I must also mention Jamil Kubeka's Of Good Report from 2013, which was banned on the grounds that it was child pornography. This evoked the censorship associated with apartheid and ignited controversy. Of Good Report is about a teacher seduced by a teenager who he later learns is his student. The film is a critique of the male abuse of power. It's not an erotic film, and it was eventually unbanned. The next trend focuses on popular films. There's a small but growing number of commercially successful films. These films don't reflect what many stakeholders envisioned as the new South African cinema, but they attract local audiences and they arguably speak to the mood of the nation. Popular films reveal a great deal about the local industry, including the cultivation of audiences through the use of genre and the star system. And they also reveal the challenges of working with local distributors and exhibitors whose practices undermine local films at the box office. Leon Schuster's popular appeal and controversy can be seen by looking at two of his most successful films, Mama Jack from 2005, in which he, a white man, pretends to be a Black domestic worker, and Shuk Shabalala's Guide to South Africa, released in 2010, in which he plays a Black tour guide in the run-up to the FIFA World Cup. Both are slapstick comedies in which he performs in blackface. Schuster uses blackface in a racist way to express white anxieties in the new dispensation, but also to try to contain and control Black perspectives. There are a number of other films that played well with local audiences. Ralph Simon's 2008 gangster film, Jerusalema, Jan Turner's 2009 interracial comedy, White Wedding, romantic comedies and dramas by Black directors like Tebeng Molea's Happiness is a Four-Letter Word from 2016, and Jayan Moodley's Keeping Up with the Kandasamis from 2017. The final trend focuses on the refragmentation of the industry in ways similar to the cinema of apartheid. Here, I focus on the return of an Afrikaans language cinema and the emergence of Nollywood-style low-cost films for Black audiences, both of which indicate a market-led approach to developing cinema. Afrikaans cinema is the only segment of the industry to consistently attract audiences at the box office. This is in part a reflection of the economic clout of this particular demographic. These films are often funded in part by Mnet and later shown on their Afrikaans language channels. Mnet is a subscription-based satellite channel owned by Naspers, a transnational corporation that has been a powerhouse in South African media since the colonial era and has subsequently spread through the African continent. Naspers also owns MultiChoice, MultiChoice's DSTV, a satellite television provider. Two genres within Afrikaans language cinema promote their own myths of nation that are used to mobilize Afrikaner nationalism. There are teen comedies like Bakhat from 2008, and the title translates to cool, that project South Africa as almost exclusively white, idyllic, and removed from the racial diversity or economic inequality that shaped the nation. There are also white farm killings dramas like Platland from 2011, and that title translates to Countryside, and Troerground, which translates to Land of Sorrow, from 2015. These films depict white farmers as the moral core of the country and under threat. Alongside these films, another phenomenon has taken hold, this one aimed at Black audiences. By the early 2000s, Nollywood, Nigeria's straight-to-DVD industry, had developed a following in South Africa. Its success inspired homegrown versions known as bubblegum movies. These are micro-budget films about life in present-day South Africa. And this is, I think, a good time to note that televisions and DVD players are actually very widely available in South Africa. And according to research done by the NFVF, audiences preferred these particular mediums for watching films. Bubblegum movies bring pleasures to long neglected Black audiences. Advancements in digital technology made this possible by making the means of production and distribution more accessible. These movies emerged from the grassroots as entrepreneurial endeavors. As Mystery and Elipin note, they're often criticized as being politically regressive, promoting stereotypes, focusing on witchcraft, and representing, or I should say misrepresenting, traditional cultures. But they capture day-to-day social and cultural issues, and so they have resonance. In 2003, Chico Twala became one of the first straight-to-DVD producers with the release of Muruti Watsotsi, which translates to Conman Priest. It's a colloquial narrative about the vices of the city and the dangers of neglecting tradition. It was a hit. Twala uses African languages and targets people who he says have been denied entertainment, which includes shack dwellers and people living in rural areas. Twala's 2008 film, My Shitfather and My Lotto Ticket, follows a similar formula. Given the popularity of bubblegum movies, Mnet started a channel dedicated to them. Afrikaans cinema has failed to come to terms with the multiracial democracy. Meanwhile, bubblegum movies share features of the films made for Black audiences during apartheid. These moralizing films don't directly address broader social realities, but they represent fantasies of wealth within the context of inequality and evince an ethic that rebukes the exploitation of ordinary people. It's no surprise that race and class profoundly shape the way South Africans imagine and make sense of their nation. However, the neoliberal focus on markets as a way to drive content, along with the broader failure of government to transform South African society, has further reinforced the tendency to create films for specific audiences defined by race and class. And this has implications for notions of nationhood. I also want to briefly touch on the role online streaming services like Showmax and Netflix, as well as piracy, play in the contemporary landscape of South African cinema. Recent developments in online digital distribution, have the potential to stimulate production and increase the accessibility of local films. But the high cost of broadband internet and mobile data in South Africa, coupled with high rates of poverty, limit the widespread use of streaming. Government underinvestment and delays in migrating broadcast signals from analog to digital have exacerbated this situation. Showmax is a streaming service that's owned by Naspers, and it has an extensive catalog of local films. It has about 334,000 subscribers. Netflix has an estimated 300,000 to 400,000 subscribers, and its subscriber base is growing. The availability of South African content via Netflix varies depending on the market. There's country-specific distribution rights at play. Recently, Netflix has commissioned several original South African shows, and it has increased the number of South African films in its collection. Netflix has the potential to shake things up in the local industry, but it's not really clear that it will do so in ways that make things more equitable. Piracy in South Africa, as in many other nations, is connected to poverty and inequality. As Primo and Lloyd argue, low incomes and a ubiquitous advertising culture which creates consumer demand for various media products, combined with the issue of an expensive, out of reach, and vulnerable formal market, create opportunities for inexpensive, easy to access alternatives in the illicit market. Given this reality, it's not surprising that informal distribution practices such as piracy have thrived. While piracy is an issue that affects the sustainability of the South African industry, it's arguably not the industry's biggest problem. High rates of poverty, the dominance of Hollywood, the paucity of available screens, and the small number of local releases that get distribution deals are all structural problems that actually fuel piracy. Even with a substantial uptick in local releases starting in 2010, many of which made it into theaters, most films still do poorly at the box office. The illicit market sells DVDs for between 10 Rand and 40 Rand, so about $1.40 and about $5.50. And it tailors offerings to the tastes of particular consumer markets, which range from Hollywood blockbusters, Bollywood films, American TV shows, and South African films. So interestingly, in the Johannesburg market, newly released international movies and not yet broadcast television series appeal to middle-class consumers. Bollywood films appeal to a South Asian population, and South African films and older action films appeal to Black public transit commuters at the lower end of the market. And this suggests that it's not necessarily the case that South African films don't appeal to the majority of South Africans, but rather that in the absence of affordable and accessible formal venues and sales outlets, they obtain these films by other means. So in conclusion, I argue that while the film industry has grown in key ways and contributed to economic development and to job creation, access to the various mechanisms of the film industry and its products remains profoundly unequal. Consequently, the film industry has not succeeded in projecting nation in a way that promotes social cohesion or establishing a national cinema. Audience fragmentation, along with neoliberal policies and the emphasis on the market, has led to multiple South African cinemas, which represent race and nation in distinctly different ways. And I think we'll leave it there, and I look forward to your questions and engaging in conversation. Thank you. Oh, can't hear you, Akin.
Yeah, sorry about that. I was saying that you were just right on time because this is 11:40, and well, maybe I took a few minutes of introduction, so you did very well, and it came across very well, but visually and in terms of what we hear. So I've seen a couple of responses. I'll just take a quick one from Phyllis. It's a very exciting presentation. So I also have a couple of questions I jotted down as you spoke, but let me take Phyllis Towers one, which says, which asks you, what's the most surprising thing you learned while doing work on this book?
Thank you, Phyllis. And I appreciate that question. I started working on South African cinema as a master's student in the early 2000s. And I think at that time, I was really committed to like the notion of third cinema and developing an authentic kind of revolutionary or radical film as, you know, a kind of more authentic South African cinema. And the more that I engaged in learning about both South Africa's film industry and things happening elsewhere on the African continent, I really moved away from that perspective and really began to consider the different forms of cinema that were produced and why different audiences connected with these films that sometimes might be dismissed as being politically regressive, for example, but are nonetheless entertaining or empowering. And so I think that is really the biggest thing that I shifted on and learned throughout, you know, the course of this research over 2 decades.
Okay, well, thank you. There's another question from Mofola Ajayi. I don't know whether it's Professor Mofolabo Ajayi Shoyinka, but it doesn't matter. He's a member of audience, and the question is, thanks you first for this research, and ask if in your language chart, the films that are in Afrikaans and isiZulu, that by 2017 they were no longer seen, does that include bubblegum films, or were they replaced by other language films like Xhosa?
Yeah, so those charts represent top 10 films that were distributed in local theaters. And so bubblegum films are not distributed in local theaters, and therefore they're not represented in the box office charts, if you will. And the National Film and Video Foundation actually has a wonderful repository of research information. And so they compile annual research reports on the way that films performed at the box office. And so the reason that isiZulu films, I think, dropped off in 2017 is because there just weren't any, you know, that made it into the top 10 films. And those charts wouldn't include straight to DVD films like bubblegum movies that are distributed in different ways, not formally in theaters.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, so I have a couple of questions, and I think I'll just put them together and you can answer them. The first set, that is, the first one has to do with your focus on narrative feature-length films. And you did say in your book that you did not consider documentary, but you didn't give a reason for not. You basically said that they fall outside the scope of your work. But given the conceptual questions that you raised in this book, I would imagine that a genre like documentary or even a particular kind of standard practice might be of interest. But so I am actually interested in your reason for excluding them. That's number one. Also, when looking at the if you want, the jacket of the backcard, those African language films that are popular, I noticed the one with the footballer who's wearing a footballer shirt. I actually thought it was co-production because I saw a merge of South African and England British flags. Oh. So is there a trend here, especially, you know, given that there are different cinematic, I mean, you spoke at length, both in your presentation and in your book, about Nollywood. So is that an element of your research that you found interesting or useful or viable for the future? That's the question of co-production. So I think maybe those two, if you want to address them for now.
So thank you for those questions, Akin. So I'll take the first one first, which is on documentary. And this is very much a study of the context of the film industry and how the political economy of the film industry shapes representational practices. And it's really trying to offer a holistic view of what happens with feature-length narrative fiction films. And what happens with documentary films is quite different because the production context is quite different. The way that those films are funded and the way that those films are distributed and oftentimes viewed and accessed, it's just different than the cycle for feature-length narrative fiction films. And so I thought it was important to separate that out for the purposes of what I was trying to accomplish in this study. And same thing with short films, which there's some interesting developments in short films in South Africa. But again, the context of production and distribution is very, very different. And so I felt like that kind of muddied the waters. I do have other work that's focused on South African documentary films.
Yeah.
In my next book will be focused on documentary films because there's actually a paucity of research in South African cinema studies on documentary films, both in the past and the present. So that's where I'm turning my attention next. And then the question about the Bokhat films. So that's a film franchise. It's kind of taking a cue from the Hollywood model, where if you have one film that worked and was popular with local audiences, then, you should have several and kind of tap into the fan base of that film and replicate the model. And so, you talked about Bokhat 3, in
Yes.
which the film's protagonist goes to England to become a rugby player star, and has various challenges and experiences once he's there. And so that, I think, was an attempt. It's not a co-production, if I'm recalling correctly, but it was an attempt to broaden the potential audience base for this film franchise.
Okay, so but is there a possibility? Do you see that as that? I mean, since even while you were working on this, do you see that as a trend? I'm talking in terms of production now, because I mean, given that maybe a few weeks ago, there's some kind of Nollywood book called a film called Namate Wahala. I mean, they will always expect things like that to happen sooner or later. And given especially the focus that you've given to Nollywood films here, I'm just wondering whether that doesn't even have to be between South Africa and Nigeria, maybe different parts of the continent, or also even in Europe. So is that a trend? Is that something that's of interest to you, like expanding the scope of your work?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that relates to the trend of co-productions and trying to expand audience space, because the audience in South Africa is relatively small. So if you're trying to make films that are financially viable, you have to sometimes seek other markets, and that plays out in a number of different ways depending on the kinds of films that we're talking about, and particular films and particular filmmakers. And so there are some filmmakers, like Akina Matosho comes to mind, who has in various ways, worked on like Nigerian, South African co-productions to try and access broader audiences and to tap into different kinds of resources. So you do see that. There are some South African-based Nigerian filmmakers that, are engaging in the Nollywood model too, trying to access, expand the audience base there. And then, for the purpose of my book, I really focus on this in the second chapter of my book, which looks at films that have local stories, but really try and attract a global audience. And usually this means, in the context of South African producers and funders, the United States and Europe, trying to access those markets, which they see as particularly lucrative with their films. And so, that involves a number of different strategies. Casting Hollywood stars is one strategy. Trying to tell stories in ways that will, for example, resonate with an American audience more than a South African audience is another strategy. And so we see that with films like Zola Maseko's Drum, or the film based on Andy Krog's book, Country of My Skull, In My Country. The way those stories are told, how they're cast, is really meant to attract an American audience. And so while one can understand that, in helping to get a film made and perhaps make it viable, the outcome is often that South African audiences don't connect with the film, and actually find, in many instances, these films problematic.
All right. Okay. There's another question. I had one, so something came in to save me from having to formulate my own for now, but I'll still do that in a moment. This is Mohammed asking you, well, first thanking you for giving a very good edifying presentation, both in terms of the writing and the work that you did at the moment. So the question is, what place you place do series like Queen Sono and Kings of Joburg occupy in the annals of South African cinema?
Okay, thank you for that question, Mohammed. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not familiar with Kings of Joburg, but with Queen Sono, the Netflix series, I do think it has the potential to perhaps shake things up in terms of stimulating local production. If you can develop, in this case, it's a series, more akin to like a television series than a feature-length film, that are filmed locally in South Africa, have local writers, directors, and actors, but are able to capture an international audience, and find a market on Netflix, that could pave the way to other films and series being produced, and that could have a kind of invigorating effect on the film industry. But again, who's the biggest market there? Is it thinking about South African audiences, or is it thinking about global audiences? And so who would be included in these stories and who would be excluded in these stories? And so I think it has the potential to contribute to the growth of the industry, but I'm not sure that some of those who have historically been excluded in terms of production, distribution, and access will be included in developments in this new model.
Okay. All right. So let me now come to the question that was just on my mind before I saw this, and that you mentioned Suleiman Ramadan in the course of your presentation, the South African filmmaker who made Zulu Love Letter, Fools, and other works, highly regarded. I'm just interested in what you said in response to Phyllis's question about what changed in the process of your work. And I mean, I know that the book talks about his work to some extent, but I'm just interested in that kind of filmmaking, okay, of people like him. I mean, why would you not see potentials for a national cinema, however defined, in that you did say when making this presentation that there is a South African cinema industry, but South African national cinema does not exist or has not in that way. So I'm just interested in that. I'm not saying that it is, that his work is that, but I'm saying potentially the kind of filmmaking that you see him and generations, and even more younger people, maybe not Nakio Motosho, but there are all sorts of filmmakers in South Africa, men and women who do very interesting work, like Jenna Bass and all of that. So when you take all these permutations together, how do you use that, especially going back to the work of Ramadan Suleiman, for instance? How do you do that to begin to tease out the potentials of this very elusive category called national cinema?
Yeah. So first, I should make clear, like, I have, begun to look and understand cinema in more expansive ways. I still have my particular favorites, and Ramadan Suleiman's films are certainly amongst my favorites. For the way that they imagine the nation. He's really been a pioneering filmmaker. So he was the first Black South African to direct a feature film after 1994. And I do think he's become one of the nation's, if not the nation's, most innovative and courageous director. And he has refused to conform to the demands of commercial cinema. And so he's has two feature-length narrative fiction films. One is Fools from 1997, and that's based on Njabulo Ndebele's novella of the same name. To Nanji's point in the chat that I see just popped up there. And that film is set just months before Nelson Mandela is released from prison, and the dismantling of apartheid begins. And that film revolves around Zamani and Zani, two men from different generations who are often in conflict with each other as they try to contend with apartheid's impact on them as individuals and on their community. And, stylistically, it's very different than most South African films, in that Suleiman is influenced by African filmmaking practices from other parts of the continent, especially from West Africa. And that's different than most South African filmmakers who've looked more towards Europe and the United States. And so the way that he tells stories, the pace of the films, the structure of the narrative, the colors that he uses, for example, are quite different. Devi called Fools a very messy story, that was arguably told at the wrong time, but she says that it was precisely, Suleiman's courage to tell this story during South Africa's democratic transition that makes it such an important movie. And then his follow-up film, Zulu Love Letter, from 2004, focuses on really healing within the context of the Black community with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission happening in the background. And it's a nonlinear film that focuses on a Black woman who was a journalist during the apartheid era and witnessed the assassination of an activist, and focuses on her attempt to just cope in the new dispensation. And so Suleiman uses what he calls, he doesn't like the term flashbacks, and so he calls them interludes, these moments where the past is just so profoundly with Thandeka, the protagonist, in the present. And we can see so much the connection between the past and the present in the lives of South Africans today. So it's a beautiful film. And again, very different than most of what you see in South African cinema. So Suleiman's work are amongst my favorite films, and ones that I do think could be emblematic of a national cinema, because they aesthetically and thematically, I think, really draw from South African culture and traditions and practices. But a national cinema is different than a national film industry. And so I make the case that there is a national film industry. I mean, it's been somewhat impacted by the pandemic, but there is a vibrant film industry that's largely focused on servicing international productions. American and Europe productions come to South Africa to shoot on location because it's cheaper. The labor is cheaper than shooting in Europe or in the United States. And so there is a pretty vibrant service sector that fuels the local film industry. And there are many dimensions to the film industry. It's very well, developed and has its different areas of specialization. And so it's active. And I say that there is a film industry, but there isn't necessarily a national cinema, because the film industry isn't inclusive in so many different ways. Who gets to make films, how they get to make films, how those films are accessed, and who can access them, I think prohibits us from thinking about South African cinema at this stage as national. And I think I covered all your questions with that response.
Yeah, sure. So do you want to take Abdul Nanji's question about adaptation. I think you made a passing reference to it, but I don't know whether you saw that when you were speaking or whether.
Yeah. Well, first of all, special hello to Nanji, who I know from my days at Cornell. So great to see you here in the chat. And there are a number of films that have been adapted from novels or other texts, but perhaps not so much by Black writers, and that's where the gap is. So here I think of Catch a Fire was adapted. There's another Truth and Reconciliation film that stars Hilary Swank. The name is escaping me at the moment.
Red Dust.
Red Dust.
Yeah,
that was based on a novel.
Mm-hmm.
And
Gillian Slovo?
Yeah, by Gillian Slovo, exactly. Yeah. And, you know, Suleiman based his first film on Ndebele's novella, Fools. So there is a tradition of that, but it's perhaps not as extensive as one would think, or perhaps like. I think there's particular challenges with adapting literary works to screen that, you know, in the early years of the post-apartheid film industry, perhaps, you know, when it comes to South African screenwriters and their skills, they weren't like, screenwriters have gotten a lot better, I think, in South Africa in the last 2 decades, in part because of the expansion of training in the realm of film writing and film production and so forth, and South African more experience in the film industry. So I think that those are some of the reasons why we don't see so many, but there are a handful.
All right. Well, okay. No questions in the chat box yet, but if I may, I mean, I don't want to, I'm moderating this, so, and I don't want also to turn it into a back and forth between us, but to actually sustain this, I wonder what you could say to this notion of the bubblegum genre. Mm-hmm. Because actually, I mean, in my teaching in African cinema, mm-hmm. for instance, when I teach stuff by Wanorika Hill, and my students, of course, are very interested in that kind of film for very obvious reasons, because it's very cutting edge, you know, mm-hmm. deal thematically with the kind of thing that they see. But then when they see this, go on YouTube and see all these things about, you know, about TED Talks that talk about genres within African countries, like bubblegum, like Nollywood, like, you know, Jennifer Diaries kind of writing or filming. I mean, I think they are very, in a sense, they are not mainstream in the sense in which you could say even a film like Pumzi or Rafiki or the film by Jenna Bass, blanking out on the title, but about the little girl from Zimbabwe whose father digged a hole and tunnel. Yeah, that's from Tunnel. Okay, so I mean, they are not there, but they have very interesting relationship with the so-called bubblegum genres. So I'm just thinking in terms of really the street level kind of perspective. What could you say about that? I mean, in a very real sense, your work is very inclusive. You bring up all these questions, but in order to really also sort of listen to the people, in the sense of what is actually interesting. I mean, you've written about Dear Mandela, a very fascinating documentary, which is told from the point of view of poor people trying to struggle for land. So I'm just interested in that. What can you say to that, to sort of bridge this gap, which actually is already breached, but you know, we just basically need to pay attention to it to see how that is between those who are so digitally connected and those who may not seem to be, but are really, really very much into what's going on in terms of really putting up the kind of material that people want to see. I mean, when you were talking about those films that play to popular audiences, I just remember Tyler Perry's work, which to me, I don't really, you know, but at the same time, these are the things that people watch, and these are for very interesting ways. these are also the kind of people who read a book like Americana by Chimamanda Adichie, at that level. So, I mean, what can a genre like Bubblegum tell us about how this, different discrete audiences, or if you want, publics, continue to coexist and overlap and speak to one another in ways that we usually don't hear. So there are a few questions on, but please, if you can say a few things about this, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly. So I think one question is, well, how do we even define the mainstream? Like, what's mainstream in South Africa? What gets considered mainstream? And if we're thinking about audience, I would say like bubblegum movies or the straight to DVD movies are probably more mainstream than most, if not all, other forms of South African films.
Okay.
If you just think about the number of people who are watching them, right? So Chico Twala's films tend to sell like 300,000 copies each. Those are numbers that he reports. Those are that doesn't include piracy, right? And pass along rates and that sort of thing. And then most South African films that are released in movie theaters, if they're lucky, they have a few thousand people who pay for tickets and see them in theaters. And so you're talking like the scope and reach is so much different. And I think that bubblegum movies actually have a much broader reach and are arguably more mainstream. Than some of these other forms of South African films. And they're so popular that, Mnet and also free to air television stations in South Africa have tried to get in on their popularity and embrace that model, that kind of micro budget model, in order to grow their audience base, and it's also inexpensive content. So it makes sense for them to do that. And I think that for a lot of audiences who aren't used to seeing themselves on screen, these films are empowering because they are shot on location, in local neighborhoods and townships. People see themselves, their community, their day-to-day experiences represented on screen, and they can identify with that. And in fact, they long for that. And we know how much representation matters. So I do think, from that context, it makes their popularity make sense. Also, people don't necessarily want to watch like a heavy hitting political film. Lives can be challenging enough. They want to be entertained. They want to have a good time. And so bubblegum movies, offer that kind of escapism, but in the context that they can really identify with. The other really popular filmmaker in South Africa, if we think about, he's controversial, but if you think about it from a box office perspective, is Leon Schuster. And he's, a white man who makes these slapstick comedies and has been making them for many decades now, going back to the days of apartheid up until the present. Some people compare his work to like a Tyler Perry figure in the United States, in part because of some of the stereotypes that he, produces in the films. And his films have resonated with audiences, according to research, across racial lines, even though they're so often racist, which is interesting to think about too. Yeah.
All right, thank you. That's helpful. There are a couple of questions that I think are really very engaged with what you've been saying. First is by Toyin Akinsho, who someone I know who's actually from Lagos, asking you to talk about how soap operas, which are really very fundamental to how Nollywood took shape, aren't that, and they're South African soap operas. So why do they not sort of take off? Why South African feature films aren't really borrowing maybe generic thematic, even production ideas from soap operas? That's one. And then there's another one by Addis Care, thanking you for giving us a very interesting picture of South African cinema. Also asking if you could please reflect on the thematic intertextuality of the films that you've been talking about.
Sure. Okay, so the first question, thank you, Toyin, about soap operas. Soap operas are incredibly popular in South Africa. They have large audiences locally, and they've also traveled around the continent and through the diaspora. And so they have managed, the creators behind these soapies have managed to create stories that are compelling and really resonate with audiences. So it's not like it's an impossible thing to achieve. And South African films really have not resonated in the way that soap operas have. And so that's a question I ask in my book too. And I think part of it has been from certain sites of power, I guess you could say, in the film industry, whether it's looking at the National Film and Video Foundation and what they have considered excellence in cinema, or what they often called world class. It's not really what we associate with a soap opera. It's a different kind of cinema. And they have really been outward focused, certainly for their first decade or so of existence, and arguably even after that they're looking to the European market and to the American market, and so they're funding films that they hope achieve a certain kind of standard, and to reach those markets and audiences. And I think that that's actually been a flaw, because then those stories aren't necessarily well received, not just in South Africa, but most South African films. There are a few exceptions, like SCHUKSI, for example, but they don't do particularly well in the international market either. And so maybe that's not the right formula or the right mix. And things have started to shift more. So like the NFVF is looking more to fund films that will be popular within the South African context. And some of those films, here I think of Happiness is a four-letter word, for example, probably draw more from a kind of South African soap opera model, plus, the kind of rom-com or romantic drama genre that we associated with Hollywood, sort of blending those two. So I do think that there's something there. In terms of thematic intertextuality, I do think that there are themes that in the different trends that I identify, which are not like fixed or static. I think it's a useful way to frame what's happening in the film industry, but these categories aren't rigid and they bleed together in different kinds of ways. I do think that there are certain thematic preoccupations that persist in a lot of South African cinema. And so much of that has to do with the country's colonial and apartheid past and moving forward in the present in a new kind of dispensation. And so those themes might manifest in different ways, but they're so present. If we're thinking from an animated film like Kumba, that's meant for more like a youth market, to films, seeking global audiences like SCHUKSI, or some of the truth and reconciliation films, and even, the independent films like Zulu Love Letter, or Sib Shangwe Lemur's Necktie Youth. It's all about reckoning with the past and how that plays out in the present. And so I think that really links so many of these different kinds of films together.
All right. Okay, thank you. Those are very insightful responses. There are a couple of questions more. One is by Grima Negash. He's here. Okay. That's the president of the ALA. He was asked you if you could talk about the representation of jazz music in South African cinema. The sense that is even going way back to something like Come Back Africa. Yes, Come Back Africa. It's interesting that that's the first place you saw back, and a much younger Louis Nkosi. In any case, you know what I'm talking about. So, and that's how the music began to be integrated. So that's one question. And another question from Phyllis. You have a lot of support here, asking what kind of films are shown in those. This is very interesting because when you were presenting, you mentioned maybe a total of 90 cinemas, that is cineplexes. And so the question is, what kind of films are shown in those independent, especially independent ones in South Africa? So those are two questions from him.
Okay, I'm going to take Phyllis's question first. So yeah, there are, according to my count, I went through and tried to count each individual theater in South Africa, and I came up with a number of 93 theaters. And, you know, within those theaters, there's something like 600 screens or so, you know, especially because the megaplexes have many theaters within them. And something like 85% of theaters in South Africa are owned by the two chains, Ster-Kinekor and New Metro. Now, there are other independent theaters that represent the remainder of those theaters. There's really only 2 movie theaters in South Africa that are committed to showing independent South African films. There's the Bioscope in Johannesburg, and there's the Labia Theater in Cape Town. And so they show, you know, films from other places as well, but they have consistently made space for the more art house or independent kind of South African films too. So that's, you know, they have shown films like Dear Mandela, the documentary, and some of the other films that I cited in my presentation today. So for example, I think 34 South, back in the day, some of Akino Motosho's films, some of Ramadan Suleiman's films, those sorts of things. Now, the other independent films, you know, their owners maybe own between like 1 and 4 theaters each, and they tend to show Hollywood films, maybe some of the more popular oriented South African films like the Afrikaans language films too. But most of the other independent theaters, if you will, are still relying on Hollywood product. There's other kinds of distributors that are growing in South Africa too. So there's like mobile film units that have experienced a resurgence in recent years. And one example of this initiative is Sunshine Cinema. And so they have mobile film units and like local film ambassadors that are showing a range of different kinds of South African films, you know, the more political and art house kind of films, but also, you know, films that are aimed more at a youth market and the popular films. And they show those in like community halls, you know, or outside, you know, screenings and that sort of thing. So there are some interesting innovations happening there. And then, you know, there's the film festivals. There's a number of different film festivals in South Africa, and they oftentimes show independent films as well. And then into Gurmai's question about jazz music, I don't know how great my answer is going to be on this, but yes, certainly if you think about a film like Come Back Africa and its representation of jazz and the kind of political progressivism and experimentation that it represented, and how that was really counter to what was happening with the apartheid regime and its conservatism. And so it becomes a kind of rebellion. You know, in the few kind of Black-centered films that were produced around the 1950s, you have jazz being featured. If you think about contemporary South African cinema, you know, I think of Ramadan Suleiman's films here too. And so his soundtracks often include, you know, jazz music as well. And so we do see that as a kind of aesthetic and political marker, I think, in some South African films, but definitely not in the more contemporary popular films, no.
Yeah, and I think there have been a couple of documentaries about the jazz musician Ibrahim. Okay.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you have that, and I think there are maybe outside the continent that is related to South Africa have been some kind of Black mixtape like that really basically talk about relationship between African or Black political struggles across the world and the impact of music, especially jazz. So
yes.
Anyway, all right. I think we can actually stop here.
Okay.
You've done a wonderful job. Thank you so much for helping us understand this extremely interesting, fascinating, complex, but endlessly engaging cinematic tradition, and actually it's a new culture, so to speak. And there's a lot to see, there's a lot to know about it. So you've guided us very well. And congratulations again on your book. And more grease to your elbow, as we say, as you work on the next step. So thanks so much. We'll leave it here. Our next presenter is similarly a new book, and that will be next.